Afternoon. I think SpaceX was announcing its concept for a heavy lift booster, and the essence of the story was that NASA should let private companies take over things like heavy lift booster rockets and get on with developing a nuclear thermal rocket.
I'm all for it.
Good evening. My own path takes me to the private space industry, especially privatized space flight. And I had a question that's twofold, one building on the other. My first part of the question is, why is it that whenever we have a discussion of the private spaceflight industry, it remains within the paradigm of the private sector as an accessory to a centered government endeavor? That is to say, that we are having these companies produce things to then be used by, say, NASA, rather than functioning independently. Is that a possibility? My second part of the question is there any historical analog within the history of aviation for a turning point that represents that kind of motion away from a government agenda into a completely privatized scope?
Well, for the first part, I think there's a lot that actually going on in private space that is fairly well segregated from government space programs. A lot of the interest in personal space flight, space tourism, not really linked to the government at all. These companies out there are perhaps seeing government as an additional ancillary customer, because the same vehicle that can fly, high net worth tourists could also fly experiments for NASA or another government agency. But they're not focusing themselves entirely on developing something that would then serve primarily or solely the government. I think you see a lot of activity out there that's designed to serve the private sector, and it's also interesting that you see a lot of conventional launch vehicles in use today that were developed in part or totally with government money being used to serve the private industry. A lot of communication satellites are launched on Ariane and Proton in Russia, and occasionally something like Atlas here in the U.S. Not very often these days, but vehicles that were developed primarily with government money, primarily to serve government needs, but they also sell the launches commercially. So that's almost sort of an inverse, if you will, of that things that are developed on the public sector are also being used to serve the private sector. But I think you see a lot of activity out there right now in the private sector that would be just fine if they never had to deal with the government beyond getting their licenses and their other regulatory issues taken care of.
To the second part of your question, that's the analog. In the 1920s, Tim mentioned it, the post office took over, they began delivering mail by air, 1918. And the idea was that originally it was going to be government planes, government-owned pilots, government-hired pilots, and so on. But they were going to lay the groundwork for potentially creating a commercial airline industry in the United States, which was already happening under government auspices in Europe at that time. You have the origins of KLM and British Overseas Air Corporation and so on, dating from the same time period. But then in 1925, you get the Kelly Bill, and 1926, you get the Air Commerce Act, which turned over that airmail system to private carriers. Hence, you get the private airline industry in the United States, which was, again, different from the model in Europe where it was all state-sponsored, but it came with government regulation. You could have the private space, but they have to understand that even though the government may not be your customer, they are going to be your regulator. Because you fly through this thing called airspace before you get to space. And airspace is national, and people regulate that. And suborbital flights in particular are going to be subject to this because countries do claim airspace up to the edge of space. So if you're suborbital, you're going to run into all these regulations. So there's going to be a lot of government involvement, even in the private space flight endeavors, simply because of the legal and regulatory structure that has grown up around space that in some ways mimics that which grew up around commercial aviation.
Wait, I'll add one other thing. Maybe the most important thing that came out, or one of the most important things that came out of the X Prize was not actually the $10 million check that Scale Composites got, but it was the impetus that got passed later that year, a fairly obscure piece of legislation called the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004. And that basically got rid of a lot of the regulatory uncertainty surrounding suborbital commercial spaceflight. There was already a launch licensing regime in the U.S. That dated back to the 1980s, but it was unclear how that would apply to commercial suborbital vehicles. There were people within the FAA who said, well, a lot of these vehicles have wings on them. They're just rocket-powered aircraft, so they should be regulated like aircraft, which is a much higher standard of certification than the launch licensing that's done for a typical rocket. And basically, the X Prize provided the impetus to say, well, no, these are spacecraft, these are launch vehicles, and they should be licensed as such. And so that bill got passed in the last hour of the Senate session that year. Squeaked through literally like that, but it helped wipe away a lot of the regulatory uncertainty that helped pave the way for a lot of the developments that we've seen from other suborbital companies in the 5.5, almost 6 years since then.
One of the things the government has done historically in aviation is create markets. And one of the things happening right now is the Air Force is actively trying to create a market for alternative non-petroleum fuels, basically by certifying its own aircraft and setting its own goals for using these fuels. And by doing that, it simply creates the Air Force as a huge customer, and there are lots of companies out there now working with the federal government and other governments to develop and certify and begin producing commercial quantities of alternate fuels. So that's one of the roles that government can play. And in the case of space flight, I think that is one of the roles, and I don't know enough about the history of this to know if this was intended, but I think one of the things that the International Space Station can do is create a market for human space flight to orbit. If NASA will turn over to commercial markets the job of carrying people to and from the space station. Russia to some extent has already commercialized its own. It's charging us fees to fly our astronauts to the space station. Without the space station, I don't know what the commercial market would be for a private company wanting to fly people in space. But I think that if NASA does allow and encourage commercial operators to fly humans to the space station, that could be, one of the biggest accomplishments of the space station program.
I want to say a few words remembering what aviation was like just after World War I, say the year 1920 or the 1920s, plural. For example, how many people appreciate that in 1920, one of the best ways in the world to go broke was to try to run an airline? What did work was airmail. That did have a market. Fortunately, we had people coming along who were willing to build good, solid, flyable airplanes, such as first the Ford Trimotor, which was backed by Ford, sacred name in those days, and then later the Douglas Commercial Series, the famous DC series. And of course, pretty soon we had the DC-3, which was half again as large as the predecessor, the DC-2, but it used the same engines. So now you had almost pure profit. And C.R. Smith, the founder of United Airlines, pretty sure it was him, he said that for once, we can really make money just by carrying people. We don't need airmail. It's just on top of the goods thing that we are getting by taking people in the air. And this was during the Depression, mind you. So when we have this kind of success with the DC-3 in the mid-1930s, and we compare the things that we were seeing then with the things we are not seeing currently in terms of commercial space, that's the kind of thing I have in mind when I talk about the distinction between these two industries.
People in general aviation know the phrase, the way to make a small fortune in aviation is to start out with a large one. and that's applicable to the space industry as well.
Space program.
Yeah. Elon Musk has used that line a number of times.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk about is aviation repeating itself, in that seems to me there are some analogies, and one of the analogies is based on this idea there really is a big gap today between the ability of an individual to fly in space versus what it was like, at first when we were building these aircraft. Clearly today it's very, very expensive for an individual to build his own company and fly in space. But there was a similarity, and before the Wright brothers, there were a lot of aeronautical people trying to build aircraft. If you ever go to King's College Museum in the UK, it has a dozen different kinds of aircraft that were people were building, designing, and trying before the Wright brothers came along. But the difficulty there was a novelty that they didn't have, a change in what they did and what was done afterwards to make aircraft reliable and financially viable. And that was all the early aircraft that we saw then were steam-driven, with big boilers and coal and things like that. And of course they wouldn't fly. They had the wrong propulsion system. We may have the wrong propulsion system here as well. It's very expensive to build a great big tank, fill many tons of fuel, a very dangerous situation. And I'm wondering whether we're not in a situation where we're waiting for the new novelty to appear that makes it practical. You've mentioned nuclear power, for example. Another one that's sometimes mentioned is the space elevator. So is there a situation possibly here where the analogy is similar? We're just waiting for a novel change in the propulsion system.
I've heard quite a bit about the space elevator. I'll believe it when I see it.
It's my understanding that amateurs are responding to a contest every other year by NASA.
Fine. Again, remember that article which I told you about, which was in the magazine Air and Space 4 years ago, that there were 10 companies back then, 4 years ago, which were talking very seriously about how they were about to send ordinary people into space as, shall we say, astronauts. I use the word loosely. That was 10 in 2006. The number now is 1.
Yeah.
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously it's good, but there is this distinction. I recently wrote a book on the history of hypersonics. It was a lot of fun. But I will tell you that in writing about hypersonics, I did not have a thing to say, not even one single word to say about Virgin Galactic. Do you know why? He is not reaching hypersonics. You have to go 5 times the speed of sound to do hypersonics. And Virgin Galactic does 3. Go figure. They have got to get up about 8 times to their planned velocity before they can get into orbit and start talking about serious spaceflight. That's a lot.
Thank you.
Hello, I got